April 12, 1942. Over the pitch-black waters of the Philippine Sea, the moon hung low, casting a ghostly silver sheen across the restless waves. At 27,000 feet, the cockpit of the Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber rattled with the vibrations of its twin engines. Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Kondo squinted against the faint glow of instrument panels, his fingers tight on the throttle. The air smelled faintly of oil and fuel, mingled with the icy sting of high-altitude wind slipping through the gaps in the fuselage. Below, the Japanese fleet's carriers cut through the darkness like phantom predators. Kondo's mission was straightforward: strike at the American supply lines before they could regroup. And yet, amid the quiet hum of the crew, an undercurrent of skepticism ran through the ranks. Radar, something that the Americans whispered about, something that supposedly guided their fighters to intercept bombers at night, was dismissed outright. Japanese commanders laughed at the reports. A machine that sees ghosts, one admiral scoffed in a briefing. Our pilots have the eyes of hawks. We do not need toys to find the enemy. The irony, Kondo thought with a grim smile, was that the very technology he and his men ignored would soon define the night. His bombardier, Ensign Masaru Ito, adjusted the Norden. Inspired bombsight, unaware of the shadows closing in over the Pacific. Stars shimmered above like distant, watchful eyes, indifferent to the lives threading through the sky below. Somewhere in the darkness, across hundreds of miles, American radar operators were already at work. In makeshift huts on a remote Philippine island, young men hunched over oscilloscopes and cathode ray screens, the faint green glow illuminating sweat-streaked faces. Every blip was a heartbeat of the night, every echo a clue. They did not know Kondo's name nor his mission, but they knew the rhythm of incoming Japanese bombers, and tonight they would meet the enemy in the dark. Kondo's formation cut through the night in perfect formation, unaware of the invisible eyes tracking them. The tension among his crew was palpable but muted. They relied on speed and altitude, confident that darkness was a shield. The engine's roar filled the fuselage, drowning out whispered fears, while the sea far below reflected nothing but the stars' cold glare. At 26,500 feet, radar operators back on the American side shouted over static. Bandits inbound, bearing 070, altitude 27,000. The young lieutenant guiding the night fighter's vector nodded, flipping switches with precision born of long nights like this one. Their P-61 Black Widows were waiting, silent hunters in the black sky. Every system synchronized, every pilot ready. Kondo did not hear the hum of radar pulses, could not see the green blips tracing his path. He only felt the cold thrill of a mission carried out in the darkness. Somewhere deep in the Pacific, the first threads of an ambush were already closing, invisible, inevitable. April 12th, 1942 hours after Kondo's bombers slipped into the night sky. Somewhere 200 miles northeast of Leyte, Lieutenant James "Jimmy" Carver crouched in the cramped cockpit of his P-61 Black Widow, the twin-engine night fighter humming beneath him. His radar operator, Corporal Henry Delgado, leaned over the scope, eyes wide in concentration. The faint green blips danced across the screen, tiny ghosts that might mean life or death. Target bearing 070, altitude 27,000, closing fast. Delgado whispered, voice taut with anticipation. The Black Widow's powerful engines roared as Carver adjusted the throttle, silently counting the seconds between pulse and echo. Every click, every flicker on that glowing screen brought them closer to the invisible enemy. Meanwhile, Kondo's formation had begun to tighten, preparing for the bomb run. The Japanese pilots were disciplined, but unease fluttered in the pit of Kondo's stomach. Something about this night felt different, too quiet, too still. The ocean below offered no clues, only an endless black void. The men laughed nervously, sharing stories of past raids and victories, but none mentioned radar. That was for the Americans to worry about, they told themselves. Back on the American side, Carver and Delgado worked in eerie synchrony. "You see that, Jimmy," Delgado said, pointing at a cluster of blips that suddenly appeared on the radar. "That's more than a fishing fleet. They're moving fast, bombers." Carver's jaw tightened. This was the moment they had trained for, the moment when the technology they had mastered could turn the night into a battlefield where they alone had the eyes to see. In the distance, Kondo adjusted his heading. He could just make out the faint glint of moonlight reflecting off the ocean, the only witness to the unfolding night. The first American fighters began to break formation silently, guided entirely by radar, slipping into positions that the Japanese could not anticipate. The Black Widow's radar was a whisper in the dark, a ghostly pulse that told them exactly where to strike. Kondo's bombardier, Ito, leaned over the bomb site, unaware of the danger closing in. The first American fighter approached from below, unseen, unheard. A sudden burst of tracer fire tore through the night, and one of Kondo's escorting Zeros shuddered under the impact. Chaos erupted in the formation. Kondo barked orders, trying to regroup his men, but the darkness had become a trap. From the radar hut on the island, young operators cheered quietly as more blips appeared. The Americans could track every maneuver of the Japanese bombers, vectoring multiple fighters simultaneously. Kondo's confidence in the night sky, a confidence shared by every Japanese commander who had dismissed radar as unreliable, was collapsing in real time. The first wave of U.S. fighters engaged. The night exploded with the sound of machine guns and the faint thrum of distant engines. Japanese pilots were trained, skilled, but they were blind to the hunters in the shadows. Kondo's gut twisted with disbelief as he realized the night was no longer theirs. Every maneuver he made, every evasive turn, had already been anticipated by invisible eyes. April 12, 1942, 27:00 feet above the Philippine Sea. Kondo's formation reeled under sudden, precise bursts of gunfire. The air was alive with tracer streaks, cutting through the blackness like lightning, illuminating terrified faces for fleeting seconds. Ensign Ito ducked instinctively, fumbling with the bomb sight as a P-61 passed overhead, its dark silhouette barely visible against the stars. Bandits at 12 o'clock high. Kondo shouted over the roar of the engines, but his words barely carried over the chaos. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Sato, twisted the stick sharply to avoid a deadly stream of fire from below. The Japanese formation fractured, smaller groups peeling away to evade the invisible predators. Panic threatened to take hold. The men had expected dogfights in the daylight, surprise raids over fortified positions, but never this, a darkness where death moved silently, guided by a glowing screen hundreds of miles away. Meanwhile, Carver's Black Widow swooped through the night, radar guiding every move. The Japanese pilots were skilled, but they were blind. Carver lined up his shot as Delgado called out distance and bearing. Target 30 degrees, closing fast. Carver squeezed the trigger. The 20mm cannon spat fire, tearing into the tail of a Betty bomber. Sparks flew, a wing shuddered, and the bomber veered uncontrollably toward the ocean below. Kondo's stomach lurched. Ito, bombs away, he ordered, but it was almost ceremonial now. The mission had been compromised before it even began. The first American night fighters darted in and out of the formation, striking with surgical precision, then vanishing into the black void. It was as if the night itself had turned against them. Back on the ground, radar operators tracked each bomber's fate, adrenaline surging. Each blip that disappeared from the screen was confirmation of their work. These young men, often barely out of high school, realized that they were rewriting the rules of aerial combat. Radar was no longer a rumor, no longer an untested gadget. It was the spearhead of modern warfare. Kondo's ears rang from the gunfire echoing through the fuselage. He shouted orders, desperately trying to regroup his scattered crews, but confusion reigned. One bomber spiraled downward, smoke trailing from its engine. Another was hit in the wing, the crew struggling to maintain control. The sense of invincibility that had carried Japanese commanders through early victories had evaporated. For the first time the night, their ally, was their enemy. As the American fighters circled, re-engaging isolated bombers, Kondo's mind raced. He thought of his admiral back on the carrier, who had scoffed at radar reports. The laughter of command echoed bitterly in his memory. The Japanese pilots were brave, trained, and disciplined, but bravery alone could not counter an unseen enemy guided by the invisible pulse of technology. By the time the first wave of Betty bombers turned back toward their carriers, the toll was catastrophic. Engines burned, wings were shattered, and the survivors flew in tense silence, the eerie glow of tracer fire still vivid in their minds. Kondo, clutching the controls, realized the true power of what he had dismissed for so long. Radar did not merely detect, it dictated the fight. April 13th, 1942, dawn breaking over the Philippine Sea. The Japanese formation, once proud and coordinated, limped back toward the carriers, battered and demoralized. Smoke trailed from broken wings, fuel tanks were punctured, and the survivors carried the weight of what had just transpired in silence. Kondo's hands trembled slightly as he guided his Betty onto the carrier deck, the rumble of the engines almost drowned out by the thud of his own heartbeat. On the flight deck, mechanics and crew rushed to attend to the returning aircraft, their faces masks of exhaustion and grim understanding. The losses were staggering, not just in aircraft, but in morale. Kondo climbed out of the cockpit, his uniform streaked with oil and sweat, and finally allowed himself a glance at the horizon. The sea, once a silent companion, now seemed ominous and unyielding. Meanwhile, on the American side, Lieutenant Carver landed his P-61 on the small airstrip of a forward base. Corporal Delgado slumped in his seat, exhausted but exhilarated. That was insane, Delgado said, still staring at the radar screen. We just found them in the dark. Carver nodded, voice steady but grim. Yeah, and we just proved what radar can do. The battle of the night had been more than a tactical victory. It was a paradigm shift. For the Japanese commanders, radar had been a curiosity at best, a potential tool of little consequence. Now, its deadly efficiency had been demonstrated in stark, uncompromising terms. Reports from survivors reached Tokyo, and disbelief quickly turned to alarm. Radar-directed interceptions could no longer be ignored. The arrogance of dismissing technology had been punished in the sky, and the lesson would resonate painfully for months to come. Kondo sat in the officers' mess, quietly sipping tea. Around him, the chatter of returning pilots filled the room, all recounting the invisible ambushes, the sudden tracer streaks, the phantom hunters of the night. He thought about the laughter in the briefing rooms, the smirks at radar reports, and felt a bitter irony. Technology they had mocked had turned the very night against them. Across the Pacific, radar operators reviewed the night's engagement, analyzing every blip, every vector, every successful interception. Young men who had once doubted their own importance now understood their central role in the war. Their unseen pulses, bouncing off enemy aircraft in the darkness, had rewritten the rules of aerial combat. Every commander who had scoffed would have to recognize the future of the war would be fought not just by courage and skill, but by those who could see what others could not. For Kondo and his men, the night would not soon be forgotten. The once trusted cover of darkness had become a theater of vulnerability, and the lessons of April 12th would echo in every Japanese planning session thereafter. Radar had arrived, and it would change everything. In Tokyo, weeks later, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's office hummed with tense deliberation. Maps of the Pacific Theater stretched across the walls, dotted with red and blue pins marking fleets, bases, and airstrips. Reports from survivors of Kondo's night raid had arrived, detailing the unprecedented losses inflicted by unseen American fighters. The pages were filled with grim statistics, bomber formations decimated, trained pilots killed or injured, and most damningly, accounts of the invisible pulses of radar guiding enemy planes with surgical precision. Yamamoto, a cigarette smoldering in an ashtray, listened as his staff debated the implications. Radar, one officer said cautiously, it may not be a myth after all. The Americans are using it to guide their night fighters. Another nodded, adding, our confidence in night operations may be misplaced. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of denial lifting like a fog. What had been dismissed as unreliable, even laughable, was now a tangible threat capable of changing the dynamics of air warfare overnight. Meanwhile, in the U.S., radar operators and fighter pilots were already refining their techniques. Lieutenant Carver reviewed the night's engagement, noting weaknesses in formation patterns and points of vulnerability. We didn't just win because of our planes, he muttered. We won because we could see them before they saw us. Every blip on the screen represented not just an aircraft, but a lesson in the evolving science of air combat. These men were not just soldiers, they were the architects of a new way to wage war. Back at sea, Japanese commanders began to reconsider their approach to night raids. Kondo, now a senior officer, debriefed his men on evasive maneuvers, tighter coordination, and the reality that darkness no longer guaranteed safety. He demonstrated flight patterns meant to confuse radar detection, but he knew the technological gap was widening. The Americans had gained the upper hand not through brute force, but through innovation and foresight. In quiet moments, Kondo would look back on that night over the Philippine Sea, the first true encounter with radar-directed fighters. He remembered the eerie glow of tracers, the sudden shudders of his aircraft, the realization that his best training and instincts were rendered partially useless by an invisible enemy. The lesson was clear. Underestimating technology in war was no longer a minor error. It was a fatal one. Across the Pacific, radar was no longer a tool reserved for experimentation. It became the backbone of night operations, the unseen hand guiding pilots to victory. The Japanese command's laughter had turned to apprehension, then to strategic urgency, as they scrambled to catch up in a race they had already fallen behind in. The war in the Pacific was evolving, and the dark, once a refuge for bombers, had become the proving ground for a new, terrifying form of aerial dominance. Months after that fateful night over the Philippine Sea, the legacy of April 12, 1942, was still unfolding. Across the Pacific, Japanese pilots trained with a growing sense of unease. Manuals were rewritten, drills intensified, and night operations, once considered routine, were now approached with caution bordering on fear. Lieutenant Commander Kondo often found himself staring at new radar scopes, reluctantly impressed at the precision they offered. Technology he had once dismissed now dictated the tempo of his missions. American forces, conversely, grew confident and ambitious. Radar-directed night fighter squadrons expanded, with the P-61 Black Widow at the forefront of every engagement. Pilots like Lieutenant Carver and radar operators like Corporal Delgado became the unsung heroes of the night, their work unseen but lethally effective. The dark became an ally, not a threat, as radar allowed them to strike with calculated certainty. Each successful interception reinforced a new doctrine. Air superiority was as much about brains and equipment as it was about courage and skill. For the Japanese high command, the lessons were painful but invaluable. Engineers rushed to improve radar detection, and tactics were modified to minimize exposure to invisible enemies. However, catching up would take years, and the psychological impact of that first night ambush lingered. Pilots like Kondo carried a constant awareness that the enemy could appear from nowhere, guided not by sight, but by machines that saw the unseen. The war had become as much a contest of innovation as of firepower. Kondo often reflected on the irony. His crew had once laughed at the idea of radar, dismissing it as an unreliable novelty. That laughter had been replaced by a tense vigilance, a respect for a technology that had turned the cover of darkness into a deadly trap. He now drilled his crews on evasive patterns, on electronic countermeasures, and on vigilance, but he knew one thing: the Americans had demonstrated a critical truth. In modern warfare, being blind while the enemy had sight was a fatal mistake. Across the Pacific, every new raid, every patrol, every intercepted bomber carried the echo of that night. April 12th had been a turning point, a moment when the invisible hands of radar reshaped the war in real time. Pilots, commanders, and strategists alike learned that innovation was as lethal as any weapon, and that underestimating it could cost lives, sometimes hundreds at a time. As Kondo watched the sun rise over the battered carriers, he could see the faint glint of determination in his fellow officers' eyes. They had survived the first night ambush, but the shadow of radar loomed large over every plan, every mission, every night sky yet to be fought. The lesson was seared into memory. The night was no longer safe, and neither was arrogance. By mid-1942, the implications of that single night raid had rippled across the Pacific theater. American commanders, emboldened by the success of radar, radar-directed night fighters began integrating the technology into every strategic operation. Radar stations multiplied on remote islands, linked to squadrons of P-61 Black Widows and other night-capable aircraft. Night missions, once fraught with uncertainty, became calculated strike, ambushes in which the enemy had no warning, no advantage. In Tokyo, the Japanese Navy faced a reckoning. Commanders had always prided themselves on superior training, daring tactics, and the skill of their aviators, but those strengths, once unquestioned, were now vulnerable to machines that could see through the darkness. Kondo, promoted to oversee nocturnal operations, wrestled with the uncomfortable truth. Japanese night raids had to be rethought entirely, and catching up to the Americans' technological edge would take time the war did not afford. The psychological impact was equally profound. Pilots who had once flown confidently under the cover of night now approached each sortie with a sense of dread. Even the most seasoned crew members understood that the darkness could no longer hide them. Each engagement carried the haunting possibility of a radar-guided Black Widow appearing out of nowhere, its guns tracing the invisible lines of a glowing green screen somewhere far below. Training manuals, briefing notes, and carrier tactics all shifted to account for this new invisible threat. On the American side, lessons learned that night laid the foundation for the dominance of night operations. Radar, directed interception, became not just a defensive tool, but an offensive weapon. Pilots and radar operators developed an almost symbiotic relationship, reading blips and vectors in real time, coordinating strikes with deadly precision. Technology amplified skill, and skill ensured that technology's potential was fully realized. The Americans were no longer simply defending, they were hunting, and the night had become their domain. Kondo, reflecting on the past months, realized that the April 12th encounter had not only cost aircraft and lives, but had forced a strategic evolution. The battle had demonstrated a new rule of aerial warfare. Invisibility was no longer a guarantee, and assumptions could be fatal. Every plan, every night raid, and every sortie would now carry the shadow of radar, a silent arbiter of life and death in the skies above the Pacific. In the larger arc of the war, that first night ambush was more than a tactical success for the Americans. It was a turning point. The Pacific theater had shifted in subtle but irreversible ways. Japanese commanders could no longer rely solely on skill, numbers, or boldness. The war had entered a new phase, one in which innovation, technology, and the unseen pulse of radar determined the fate of men and machines alike. Years later, historians would look back on that night over the Philippine Sea as a quiet revolution in air warfare. April 12, 1942, was not marked by a single massive battle or heroic dogfight, but by the invisible hand of technology reshaping the rules of engagement. Kondo's raid, intended as a routine strike against American supply lines, had instead become a case study in the lethal consequences of underestimating innovation. For Lieutenant Commander Kondo and his surviving crew, the night was never forgotten. Every creak of a bomber, every flash of tracer fire, every distant engine hum reminded them of the hidden predators that had struck with surgical precision. Even as the war raged on, their tactics and strategies were forever haunted by the memory of that ambush. The lesson etched into every briefing: never underestimate the unseen. On the American side, radar became the cornerstone of air operations. The men who had operated those early oscilloscopes and cathode ray screens were no longer unknown technicians. They were pioneers, architects of a system that allowed a handful of night fighters to dominate entire formations of enemy aircraft. Their success demonstrated that the future of combat belonged not only to those who fought with courage, but to those who could see what others could not, who could anticipate and strike from the shadows. The Japanese High Command eventually recognized the necessity of countermeasures, radar detection, electronic interference, and revised night operations. But the first blow had already set a precedent. The psychological shock, the unexpected losses, and the proof of concept for radar-guided interception forced a reluctant respect for the technology they had once mocked. Laughter had turned to apprehension, and apprehension to careful study, as engineers and strategists scrambled to catch up. In the end, the night raid over the Philippine Sea was a microcosm of a larger truth. Warfare was evolving. The invisible, the technical, the unseen forces could decide the fate of hundreds of lives in a single, harrowing night. The darkness was no longer neutral. It was a theater in which mastery of technology could outweigh skill alone. And in that shadowed sky, the first true lesson of radar, directed aerial combat, was written in fire and smoke, in the trembling hands of pilots, and in the glowing green blips that had first heralded a new era of war. For those who survived, and for those who studied it after the fact, one understanding remained clear. The war had changed forever the night that American fighters found Japanese bombers in the dark. The night would never be the same.